Oh, we got our first person in here. Okay. No idea who that is, Def 20, but I appreciate recognition, even though don't think I deserve that categorization as the GOAT. All right. Oh, Ian Cassidy? Oh my God. Is that if that's Ian Cassidy, that would be. Oh my God, Cassidy. Still still got the subscribe notification. That's great. That's great. Ian Cassidy, what a blast in the past. Yeah, this is for AP comparative government. So waiting on some seniors from Boas. What's crazy, Cassidy, is that it still doesn't click in my mind that you would be like you're seniors this year. Like that's still that has not sunk in because when I look at the kids I teach now or I coach, I just there's they're mature, they're 18, college bound kids. It's hard to picture you and your group because I haven't seen a lot of you in years, although I went to a basis basketball game this winter. It was the senior night actually. So I saw Jackson, Eric, and who was the third guy? Oh, Ben Darling. Like, oh my God. I mean, they're all huge. They're all so tall. I mean, most of you guys were taller than me anyways in 8th grade, but yeah, man, after years of being away from that school, uh I don't I wouldn't say I missed the school, but I missed the students. That was a great group. And then that film class, man, that film class was great. We got screwed by COVID. Oh my God, Willis. He'll probably find his way on here and make fun of me because my AP week mustache. Willis. He was in your class, right? You guys were like I want to say, were you like the group that was right before lunch or something? I feel like your class was like right before lunch. I'm trying to remember. The film credit. That was a good class, man. I had a blast with that class. Film was 0 period. Yeah. But I think your 8th grade class, I think you guys were like the group right before lunch. I think you guys were the group right before lunch. Because I remember I had the morning class was like the really like smart group, like Marius, uh, Grace, Naomi, Anina, like that crew was like first period. Second period, who was in that class? That was like Saran, Elijah. That crew had like a little bit of personality. Claire, I forget the girl's last name, Claire. Or not Claire. Oh man. I remember she sat in the back, but Elijah was in there. Uh and then I think I had your class after my capstone or something like that. I had like 4 in a row that year. That was rough. And then I had the infamous the 8 whatever. I don't remember what element they were, but that last period with like John Swan, Jeremiah, Ray. Oh my God, Renaya. Woo, that crew. What legends they were. So what you're in, Cassidy? You're. I know. I know it's you. You just got to type in the chat, but you're. So you graduated early, right? And you're starting undergrad. Where are you going for undergrad? Yeah, basis. Yeah, it was definitely an interesting way to do school. Um, Definitely an interesting way to do school. Whoa. University of Hawaii. Good for you, Ian. Good for you. AG, what's going on? Oh, Alex Durant. See, this is going to get the basis people. This is great. I don't know if any of you guys, basis kids, are taking Comp Gov. AG, let's go. Let's get some Comp Gov questions. I'm not here just to talk to my former students. So that's great seeing some of these legends here, especially because Alex, we stole Aaron Rodgers, Josh Simpson. Oh my God, this is all bassist people. This is hilarious. Oh, so Duran, Alex, and Josh, you guys got to spread the word. I'm doing an A push review session Thursday night before the exam. So I'm doing that a review session for A push on Thursday. Spread the word. All right, cool. All right, Ella's here. Good. I got some Comp Gov people. Okay. Well, Gallagher, you know Ian Cassidy? Oh my God. Okay. Well, I'm gonna keep an eye on the chat. So I'll do my best to ignore the basis crew because the basis crew are we run deep, very loyal here in the we go way back with the basis DC crew. So definitely cool to see a bunch of you. Definitely cool to see a bunch of you, and that's hilarious, Cassidy and Gallagher. I don't know if you knew Cassidy was a played for me basketball, basis DC man, the JV varsity team. That was a quite the crew that year. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna my plan is to sort of kind of like roll through this study guide. So for those that do not have it, um, for those that do not have it that are watching and don't have it accessible, I just shared a link, and that should mean that everybody has. Whoops, stand by. Let me send you the link again. Okay, I just sent the link. That's kind of the study guide I'm gonna kind of rip through. Um, so when it comes to the when it comes to the units here, the first unit is sort of the overarching unit on political systems, regimes, governments. Um, from the sort of way we broke down each of the big six. Um, one of the topics that I know we struggled with a little bit early in the year was like understanding exactly what a regime is, and regime, that's just a fundamentally important term. Regime is whatever particular set of people uh, are in power at that given time. So currently, when we go around the big six, you've got the Putin regime. In China, you've got the Xi Jinping regime. In Nigeria, you've got now the Bolo Tinubu regime that will come to power. In Iran, you've got the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's been in power since the late 1980s, the longest running Big Six leader. That's his regime. And then in the UK, it's still the Tory party, the Conservative Party, with Rishi Sunak at the helm now. That the resignation of Liz Truss. So each of the big six countries, right? The regimes are the people or the groups that are in power. You could also use political parties to sort of a base like who's in power. So the political party itself, like right now in the United States, the Democratic government, the Democratic Party is the regime in power here under the leadership of Joe Biden. So something else about regimes, though, to identify is the exact type of regime that it is. And the regimes that it is, oftentimes, it's based upon the style of government that each regime has. So, for example, in the UK, we've got a parliamentary system. So, the UK is a parliamentary system. That's the type of regime the UK has, where they choose their prime minister within the parliament, not through a general election or popular vote or electoral college or some type of system like they have in Iran, where um, the Assembly of Experts chooses a supreme leader, or in the case of China, like its head of regime is chosen through the NPC and also the Communist Party. So the UK chooses its leader. The general election gives whichever country, whichever political party, um, whichever political party wins the general election has the ability then to choose from within its ranks a prime minister. And we had two prime ministers chosen in the course of this year's course. So historically significant and historically rare. Um, Russia is a semi-presidential system. So the president is elected through a popular vote. Although, remember, with Russia, the president has to be chosen through a majority. It's got to be chosen through a majority. That's a unique characteristic of the Russian semi-presidential system. And then you get the prime minister role, who serves as the head of government in Russia. And the prime minister in Russia is appointed by the president. So that's where you get the sense of semi-presidential. Moving through the rest of the big six, Iran is a strange outlier in terms of the type of regime that is in Iran, because Iran ultimately is a theocracy. And so the Ayatollah, or the supreme leader, is the head of religion in Iran while also serving as the head of state. However, in Iran, you don't have a semi presidential system because the president or the prime minister is not chosen by the supreme leader as it is in Russia, where the president nominates a prime minister that's confirmed ultimately in the Duma. So the president of Iran is a elected role. However, the bulk of the power within Iran resides with the supreme leader. So Iran does not fit into a category. You want to be careful. Iran is not semi-presidential, it is not presidential, nor is it parliamentary. So that's critical. That's critical about Iran. Mexico is a good example of a presidential system, and as is Nigeria. Both are presidential systems. And then the last one of the big six to identify that's the style of regime that it has would be China. So China is like Iran, neither presidential, neither not semi-presidential, and it's not parliamentary. It's not parliamentary. So that's sort of like the overarching, one of the overarching characteristics of Unit 1. Unit 1 is also sort of a good unit to establish some evergreen terms. So, for example, states. We can't get twisted in the fact that when we think of states, like in America, we think of Florida, Texas, Alabama, Missouri, etc. But states refer to the larger category. They refer to a larger category to qualify where people are living in a permanent location, there's a permanent population, and they are governed by a regime in a defined territory. So, China, I mean, all the big six, they can be constituted as states. Other important terms is a nation. So, like a nation state, for example, is a group of people that have elements in common, like race, religion, language. That constitutes the idea of nation. Um, Other important terms that come from Unit 1 have to do with the style of rule. And so I'm going to take you through some of the styles that are synonymous um, with our big six. So if we go through the political system in the UK, we've got democracy. In the UK, we got democracy. It's a democratic regime. It's a democratic regime. So that's important about the UK. And then the last characteristic about the UK is that it is unitary. It is unitary. However, the UK has been shifting more so towards federal over the last number of years. So the UK is definitely aiming and looking more federal, but UK is for sure unitary for the time being. Um, Russia is a constitutional authoritarian political system. There is a constitution, but Russia's government is authoritarian. The current regime under Putin would definitely be counted as authoritarian. And Russia is federal, right? Russia is divided into a number of smaller states. Um, and in Russia, the specific term of their states is that they have republics. They have republics. So Russia is divided into 21 republics. They also have what are called crays, which are like federal territories that are administered by the government. Russia's a bit complicated. I wouldn't sweat this too much. It's broken up into different 49 different regions. It's kind of like all over the place. But with Russia, realize that Russia is simply it's so large. It's the largest landmass country in the world. But Russia is an example of a federal system. Um, China, its political system is dominated by the Communist Party. It's authoritarian. Its regime is authoritarian and it is unitary. So the Chinese do not have a well-defined breakdown of the Chinese do not have a well-defined breakdown of its subnational levels. Iran is a theocracy and authoritarian for its political system. It's an authoritarian regime and is unitary. Mexico is a constitutional democracy. So both Mexico and Nigeria fit that category. Both Mexico and Nigeria are what we would call emerging democracies. So they have gradually become more democratic over the years, but still have some elements of authoritarianism embedded. And then, as far as government is concerned, that leaves federal. So those are the um, those are the sort of political institutions of the Big Six, which is an important part of Unit One. That's an important part of establishing Unit One is knowing those institutions and knowing how those are divided. So I'm going to pause now to give people a chance to sort of, if they have any questions, and then I can move along in breaking down these topics further. If you have a question, by the way, just have to type it in the chat. Or if no one has questions, someone is just, you know, say we're good. Let's move on. Okay. So one of the major themes in Unit 1 is democracy versus authoritarian. So let's break down each country. Let's break down each country. Jeruko, how are you? Political parties and level of efficacy that they produce within a system. Sure, I can do that next. I'm going to go over democratic and authoritarian characteristics. So in the UK is a well-established democracy. Good example of that would be that the House of Commons is directly elected by the public. Directly elected by the public. In the UK, right, characteristics of their democracy, they've got rule of law, they've got free and fair elections. The government has some control of the media, but there's a lot of private media, and you have independent branches of government. So I would consider that, like, if you're thinking of categorizing, um, if you're thinking of categorizing like what contributes to a democracy, those are four really good characteristics of democracies: rule of law, elections, government control of media, and independency of the government branches. So let's break it down through those four categories. So again, UK, strong rule of law, free elections, some government control, but not much. And then you've got checks and balances. You've got the distinguishing characteristics of um, independent branches. Mexico. Mexico's rule of law improving, on the rise. Mexico does have popular elections. There is some control, but mostly in Mexico, you've got um, private media. The one issue that Mexico faces is that journalists have been under attack. Journalists are often targeted in Mexico, and journalists are often, you know, uh, caught up in the gang and cartel violence that occurs in Mexico. And then independent branches. Yes, Mexico has independent. In fact, there's the Supreme Court has judicial review powers, and the legislature passes laws and can also um, be responsible for um, uh, confirming appointments to various branches of the Mexican government. Nigeria, another emerging democracy. Nigeria has direct elections, as we saw this year with the presidential election, although not without controversy. Nigeria, again, it has a lower rule of law ranking, but is not a country that rules by law. Again, some government control of media, but media is fairly free and open within Nigeria. And Nigeria has independent agencies, even within its government, to ensure a sense of independent branches. And then you get into the authoritarian countries. So between Russia, Iran, and China, uh, all three use rule by law, which is using the powers of the judicial branch to your regime's or your government's advantage. Um, there are elections in Russia and there are elections in Iran. However, in China, there are no direct elections of high ranking officials. The elections in China are on the lower level, the provincial and regional level. So China does not have open, free, and fair elections. Russia does have elections and has a high voter turnout in Russia. So Russians do turn out to the polls and they do vote in large numbers. But one of the criticisms of the Russian election system is that there's a lot of corruption and manipulation. In Iran, we can never forget that the Guardian Council has direct oversight over who can and cannot run for election. So the Guardian Council is an overarching, powerful body that has a lot of say in terms of who can run, and they vet candidates, and they have tremendous power. over who can run and how the election systems work. There's no free media in either of the three countries. There's no free media. And in terms of the independence and the sort of different branches, in all three cases, Russia, Iran, and China, you have rubber stamp parliaments. So they simply serve at the whim of the executive leaders, whether it's Putin, Khamenei, or Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. The legislature is not independent. Not independent. That sort of, I would say that sort of like runs us through, um, that sort of runs us through the sort of general overview of our big six. So let's take a look. I'm not sure who Yuruko is, but let's go through each of the countries on political parties. So the general concept of um, the general concept that we want to remember about efficacy is that efficacy is the general belief that the people that the people have the ability to alter their governments. Let me back up. It's effectively the idea that citizens believe they have the ability to change the course of the government's actions. That if you believe in efficacy, that the general sense is that the people believe and have faith that the government is going to do its part to protect the people and also do its part to ensure that the laws, rule of law, elections, all those factors of democracy are carried out. So that's how I would describe efficacy if you had to identify it and mention it in one of the FRQs. As far as each of the big six, so here we go. Let's sort of work our way through each of the six. So the UK is a democracy. It is a democracy, and it is multi-party. There are a number of political parties in the UK. In fact, there are more than just two. However, the UK has a multi-party system that is, for the most part, dominated by two particular parties: liberals and conservatives. Conservatives are often called the Tories. That's just a nickname, like an informal nickname for conservatives in the UK. And that is the particular group that is currently in power in the UK, the Tories. Um, so when it comes to I got you next, Ella. So when it comes to the UK, liberals and conservatives, and the UK is a good example of having a high efficacy because of the fact that in the UK, right, there's a sense that the people are directly connected to the political parties. Right? Party membership is important. It's an identifier for people, and in the end, the party that you vote for has power in that if elected to parliament, they have an ability to legislate and impact policy making. So there's a high level of efficacy, especially in multi party systems where people can find themselves involved in the process. Now, the one knock on multi party systems in terms of efficacy is that your voice perhaps gets drowned out and it's not heard and it's not carried out as much because if you're on the end of the sort of losing side, let's say you're a liberal right now in liberal party member right now in the UK and you're not the majority, then it might be difficult for your policies and your agendas to be carried out. But UK multi-party, fairly high level of efficacy. In China, there's one party. The CPC is the dominant party. However, there are multiple political parties in China. It is naive. It is naive for political parties to say there are no other political parties in China. There are many political parties, but the CPC is by far the dominant one. How does that affect efficacy? Well, you can look at it two ways. There's an argument for and against this. The argument for efficacy with a one party dominant system is that that party has no opposition for the most part. So therefore, they can effectively run the government however they choose. And that can steer the government in a direction to which you can say there's a high level of efficacy because the people trust that things will get done, that the government is going to take care of its policy because there's no back and forth. There's no partisan ship that happens, divides that can sometimes halt the spread of legislation. So that's the pro for having a one party dominant system. But on the flip side, if that one party dominant system is considered corrupt or abusive of its power, which oftentimes the CPC is, then it's awfully difficult to argue for efficacy in that case. So keep that in mind as we talk further about other countries that are also one party dominant, like Russia. Oh, Areg in the house. Love Areg. His presence being here. It's great. We'll have the A Push session on Thursday night for those of you. I don't know why. It's bizarre that it's not giving me the list. It's not populating the list of who's in the chat. So I have no idea. Yo, Big Grish. I have no idea who's actually here unless people pop in. And if it's not obvious what your name is, let me know. Mexico. Mexico. Um, Mexico is another country that relies on a multi-party system. We had for so many years the PRI that dominated Mexico, but now the fact that you had a third party win the election in the Morena party that was significant for Mexico. Uh, Iran, there are no political parties in Iran. They don't really have parties. Nigeria, multi-party system. The APC is currently the party in power. And then Russia, the United Russia is the dominant party. It wasn't always the case. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a competition for political parties, but now United Russia. The irony is, though, remember, Putin is not a part of United Russia. Okay, back to Ella's point. So civil liberties. We did a unit on this where I had you guys research some of the constitutions of our big six. So here's the best way I can describe it. And this comes from the Evergreen document. I don't know. Did I send that? I'm going to send this to all of you, even if you're not in our course at Bullis. Let me send you. I got to make the Evergreen doc. Hang on tight for a second here, folks. Because I think this is going to really help people. Someone can post a question. Next question, by the way, if you've got one, because I'm going to cover the civil liberties, civil rights for Ella in a moment here. Hi, hang on. Sorry, guys. I'll upload it to Google Drive, not Google Docs. So stand by. Okay, where's my doc? There we go. Okay, I just emailed everyone. I just emailed that to everybody, but I'll put it in the chat. So here you go. So that file is the master list of evergreen terms. To Ella Rosov's question, so civil liberties versus civil rights. Civil liberties are guaranteed protections that all citizens have against their government. We usually find civil liberties in documents such as a Bill of Rights or a Constitution. That's the most likely place to find where a country's civil liberties exist. So many countries promote the idea of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Those are good examples of civil liberties because they are guaranteed protections that the government cannot take away your freedom of speech. The government cannot take away your freedom of education. Some of you found that to be a common civil liberty that was in a lot of the big six countries was the freedom of education. Freedom of the press, which might exist in some countries. Um, the right to a fair trial. All right. The right to protections against illegal search and seizures. These are all civil liberties because they amount to ways that the citizens are protected against their own government. So that's the key. A civil liberty is a protection against your own government from taking away a freedom. Protections against your own government. Civil rights, on the other hand, are protections that the government promises to deliver. So when the government says that it will not discriminate based on sex, religion, race, ethnicity, that's a civil right. Civil rights are protections that the government puts in place in order to avoid discrimination. In China, minority groups have the civil right of practicing their own language. That's a civil right. That's a protection that the government gives to the people. That's a protection the government gives to the people. In Russia, a civil right that was taken away more recently was the LGBTQ rights or gay marriage. That's not a civil right in Russia. So if the government protects something that people can do, that's a civil right. The protection against the government is a civil liberty. So I think that's a good way to end it. That point. Ella or anyone else, if you've got other thoughts. I don't know who Bijones is, but that looks like civil liberties is being protected from tyrannical government. Civil rights is government protecting it. So that was a very well, it's basically what I said. I just probably said it a little longer. A little longer. Okay. Next question. Anybody got one, or I could sort of go back to the study guide and just identify some random topics. Social cleavages. Yeah, sure. Who is Jeruko, by the way? Is that a student that does not go to Bullis? Oh, which basis do you go? You go to basis DC or basis James from WAP? Are you in Comp Gov over there? Oh, cool. I didn't know they offered that class because it was not offered when I was there. All right. So we've got different types of cleavages, right? You have social political cleavages. You got social political cleavages. So here we go. A couple sort of concepts that we'll go through here. So in the UK, and if you scroll down in did I put the study guide? I think I did, right? Yeah. Yeah. So if you look at the study guide, so social cleavages in the UK. So the UK has a lot of immigrants, and that creates oftentimes ethnic cleavages. The UK is also big on regional differences, and this evolves from the fact that the UK is split up into four different nations: Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Those create both ethnic and regional cleavages because of the fact that, right, you're dealing with different nations. Those are different ethnic groups, but yet they're also part of the UK. In the UK, you also get severe religious cleavages. You get the majority of the UK are Protestant, but you do have Catholics living in Northern Ireland. You do have Catholics living in other parts of the UK. So that can serve as a cleavage. And then a more modern developing cleavage is immigration. So because the UK once ruled for a fourth of the world's territory, many different non-white, non-Anglo UK citizens come from South Asia, come from Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, so all parts of the world, and many call the UK home. But that's created a very important cleavage in the UK. And as a result of the UK's social cleavages, one of the important aspects is a separatist movement has emerged, especially amongst Scotland. There's been talks about Scotland breaking away and gaining its independence from the UK. So uh, that's an important social cleavage in the UK. In Mexico, one of the most important cleavages. You have two types of cleavages in Mexico. The first would be um, ethnic divisions between the sort of indigenous native peoples that were around before the arrival of Europeans. And then you have the white and sort of mixed blood people. Those are sort of like historic cleavages, but they still exist within Mexican society. Uh, Indigenous Mexicans and Native Americans living in Mexico tend to have extremely high rates of poverty. Extremely high rates of poverty. When it comes to another cleavage in Mexico, you get. Oh, excuse me. Sorry for the yawn. That just came out of nowhere. You get regional cleavages. Regional cleavages. So north versus south. Um, we talked about this in my class with the Maquiadora system that's led to a severe cleavage in Mexico, rich versus poor. And what you end up getting are certain states in Mexico that are not connected to its uh, industrialized societies, and um, those regions end up being poorer, and that's where you get, for example, the Zapatas movement in this Chiapas state, where they tried to break away from Mexico. And in response, the Mexican government has created numerous welfare programs in an attempt to shrink the poverty gap. But in Mexico, those are critically important cleavages that exist. Nigeria's dominant cleavage is for sure ethnic. You got two main cleavages in Nigeria. Ethnic cleavages, so that's driven by the fact that there are over 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria. Um, the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa are the three largest, but 250 ethnic groups, 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria. So that leads to an immense amount of cleavages there. You also in Nigeria have regional cleavages, so north, south. That's a big deal. Um, Coastal versus interior, right? Cities and towns near the coast is a cleavage, and then the most significant cleavage of all in Nigeria is the religious cleavage between Christians and Muslims. As a result of the cleavages in Mexico, like with Mexico, there have been separatist movements, um, violence. Right, some of the Muslim groups have led to terrorist activities. So Nigeria's cleavages have become sometimes quite violent. Um, Moving on to Russia. Uh, Russia has ethnic cleavages as well. Roughly 80% of all Russians are ethnic Russians. Roughly 80%. So, um, yeah, I'll get that next, Grish. So Russia has 80% Russians. Um, you do have some religious cleavages, especially between Muslims that live in Chechnya. That there was a separatist war there in the 90s, and that also was the beginning of Putin's rise to power. That he crushed the separatist movement, attempted to crush the separatist movement down there. But I'd say in Russia, it's religious and ethnic cleavages. And then lastly, in China and in Iran, China has both ethnic and regional cleavages. Like 90 something percent of Chinese are Han. But there are 55 recognized ethnic minorities, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, and that we covered in my class for sure, our class for sure, the situation with the Uyghurs. We covered that situation quite well in ours. Um, in China, you also get in China regional cleavages between like urban and rural. Uh, the vast majority of China's population um, live in urban locations, but uh, that divide between urban and rural, you could argue that that's a pretty like commonplace cleavage, not just in China but all over. And then lastly, in Iran, I would say the biggest cleavages in Iran are ethnic and religious. So while Iran is a Shia majority country, Iran does have Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and the way that Iran has dealt with these ethnic cleavages is guaranteeing seats in the legislature. So Iran guarantees that seats in its modules for the various religious minorities. And you do get some ethnic, um, you do get ethnic cleavages in Iran as well. Right? Not all people living in Iran are Iranians. You got Azerbaijanis, Kurds, and Persian, and so that creates some divide. The good thing is with the cleavages thing is that, like, generally speaking, you can almost always chalk it up to as like religious, ethnic, regional. That's pretty continuous across the different countries. Okay, supranational organizations. So supranational organizations are super valuable in the context of especially looking at like unit 5, which is the economic unit. So like how the country's economies work and what policies that they create. The standard evergreen definition of supranational is when a group of nations work together, and it can be regional or it can be international. Um, and the goal is to achieve political or economic gains. What separates a supranational organization from a multinational organization, and a classic example of supranational that we talked about um, would be like um, European Union is one of the great examples. The IMF, OPEC. OPEC is a good example of um, supranational organization. The World Trade Organization is a good example of a supranational um, organization. And so, what's what's critically important what's critically important about supranational organizations is that supranational organizations there there's a strong there's a strong sense that in supranational organizations, the nations that are a part of the organizations, they surrender some autonomy. They surrender some autonomy. That's the key point. The UN is not a supranational organization because it does not surrender power. A country that's in the United Nations does not have to follow what the UN states. If you're a member of the International Olympic Committee, which is a good example of a multinational organization, that country does not surrender power to the IOC. Like the American government does not follow orders from the International Olympic Committee. However, European countries in the EU, African countries in EWAS, I butchered that. It's not E. It's not. It's not E. Did I say Ewoks? I meant ECOWAS, right? ECOWAS is a good example of a supranational organization. That's the Economic Community of West African States, which Nigeria is a charter member. Those organizations demand subservience to some degree, that their policies have direct influence on the countries that are a part of. And so I will post. This is a good. I found a good resource here for you guys. A good definition here of the issue. So there. It's too long. Okay, hang on. Stand by. Who is BHON? Who I don't. Who is? By the way, who is that? I'm gonna get your question next. Sorry, Gritch. Whoa, what a cool emoji. Dang, what is that? I like that emoji. Oh, that's Dylan. Okay, big deal, big Grish. Oh my gosh, why? Okay, I'm trying to post the. Oh my gosh, why can't I? There you go. There's a good definition of supranational. Yeah, I like that. I like that emoji. It kind of does look maybe a little bit. Although the stash, man, got that mustache going. Okay, Big Dill wants to go over independent judicial systems. Okay, let's do it. Oh, Brick Jackson on here. Brick, are you a CompGov guy? Brick goes, for those of you from Boas, Brick Jackson is a senior from Arizona, a legend from one of my former 7th grade classes. All right, here we go. Let's go through the judicial. Okay, Brick, you're in here. The Brick first. Ben Jackson. Yeah, Ben going to John Hopkins. He's coming out to this area. He'll be matriculating to Hopkins next year. So Ben will be coming here while some of our Boas seniors are moving along. Okay. All right. So judicial systems. Again, as a quick review, civil rights are protections against the government from discriminating, because that's all part of the judicial system unit. And then civil liberties. That's when an individual is protected from the government. So, rights, the government protects individuals, and liberties protect individuals from the government. Also, with judicial unit, don't forget rule of law. That's the clear understanding, known laws that are out there. They're not arbitrary. Everybody is accountable to the law. And the rule by law is manipulating the law, your legal system, for the benefit of the regime in power. Okay. All right. So, with the judicial system, something to be aware of. You're not going to need to go into the very minutia of each court system. However, as we go through, one of the important understandings, as the question from Big Dill came in, was whether or not courts are independent, meaning they are not influenced by the executive or legislative branch. Now, certainly in many of the countries, the legislative branches are the branches that effectively have to appoint, confirm the executive branch's nominations. So in many countries, the executive branch, like for example, in Russia, Mexico, Nigeria, they nominate just judges to the judicial branch. And then the parliament or Congress, whatever the legislature is called, that legislature then in turn will confirm those justices. But independent would mean that the executive branch leaders don't have the ability to coerce or manipulate the rulings. And so we'll take you through which ones are independent and which ones are not. So the UK, which is an advanced democracy, has different court systems, right? It's got a Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court in the UK, wildly, was not created until 2009. So that's kind of an interesting. That's kind of an interesting aspect. The UK does not, I repeat, does not have judicial review. Parliament is really the gatekeeper of the UK's government. So the ability to revise the Constitution and that ability to determine the constitutionality, that's left to Parliament. That is not something that the Supreme Court has the power to do in the UK. So keep that in mind. The other thing is that the UK has a legal system that is based on common law. So that's based on the idea that previous rulings establish precedent, and the precedent in cases carries over for future cases. So the UK does not have like a codified legal system. But the UK does have a fairly independent court system, and that's a good example. And a good theme is that most democracies have independent judicial systems. Russia has two main courts. It's got a constitutional court, and then it's got a Supreme Court. The constitutional court is the one that is ultimately appointed by the president but confirmed by the Federation Council. And in the constitutional court, that's the judicial branch system that the Russians use to for judicial review. The Russian Supreme Court, however, which is also nominated by the president and confirmed by the Federation Council, is much larger, and that does not have judicial review. That's only the Constitutional Court that has judicial review. But the Russia has lower level courts, so that's kind of similar to an American style of courts where you have different layers of courts, and you have criminal, civil law. So Russia's court system is highly evolved. I would argue that Russia is not independent. That is because the Russian government operates more rule by law. And again, when we say rule by law, what that means is that the government, the government is effectively manipulating the law. The regime is using the judicial system to maximize its power, its authority, and to better cement its legitimacy. Iran has many, many layers of court, and ultimately there is a chief justice, so like a ministry of justice. The key fundamental reminder about Iran compared to all the other ones is that Iran is a country that practices Sharia law. Its law is based on Islamic law. No other country that we study is based on Islamic law. Now, in Iran, and we watched the film that centered on a legal case that was a separation. That was a nice little unit, not unit. That was a nice little activity that we did. So in Iran, the function of the court is truly to do two things. One, to interpret the law. So there is judicial review. And then two, it's to ensure that the laws do not violate Sharia law. And Iran also focuses on the idea that it is less independent because you have the Guardian Council that has to approve laws. The Guardian Council is very involved in the legal and judicial system of Iran. So Iran is not independent. Mexico would be independent. It has a Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court does have judicial review. So you can think of the Supreme Court in Mexico very similar to the United States Supreme Court in that it has judicial review. Remember, the nominations in the Supreme Court, it's an interesting process in Mexico. So they're appointed by the president, but ultimately the Senate confirms. And Mexico, remember, kind of an interesting thing about Mexico is that its judicial branch has to certify the results of the presidential elections. That's an interesting feature. And then with China, China has like a multi-tier. All the countries have multi-tiered court systems. So, but is it independent? Hell no. The CPC is calling the shots. So, the Communist Party of China has control of the national court system. The party appoints all members of the judiciary. So, if you want to be a judge in China, you better cozy up to the party. They do have like a Department of Justice in China that sort of organizes the prosecutions of things, but because the CPC is so heavily tied to the court system, that's a perfect example of how rule by law works. So, rule by law, the Chinese use the judicial system to enforce its policies and to ensure that ultimately the party's policies are being carried out. We're getting down to the last 15, 20 minutes here, so not much of a turnout here. I thought we get more participants, but I do appreciate those of you that came in tonight. So what topic or what questions would you guys like to see next? So the idea of civil society. Hi, Nat Fletch. Sure, well, I'm going to do that after I do civil society. So the idea of civil society, James and Safi, is that ultimately in a civil society, you've got people that work together in the interest of democracy. Civil society groups aim to create democratic processes in their respective countries. That's the idea of civil society. Civil society encompasses things like protest movements, grassroots organizations, NGOs. And within civil society, you got all sorts of avenues for creating democratic processes. These might include labor unions, nonprofits, churches, schools. Um, the key is that these are outside the government. Outside the government. They're not affiliated with the government at all. Um, Now, when a government has a lot of oversight into civil society, that is what is called a corporatist society. So, corporatist. Um, so that's important. That term corporatist comes up. Along with civil society, the other term that was mentioned is political socialization. So the idea of political socialization is that countries do an attempt to transform their people's ideas about government. So this sometimes political socialization sometimes works hand in hand with the development of civil society. So let's say in a country like the UK, right? The Brexit debate was a raging debate that some civil society groups, interest groups, lobbying groups, they pushed to generate more anti-EU sentiments. So the political socialization of the Conservative Party in the UK aimed for political socialization in the sense that it wanted to convince people to vote in support of Brexit. That's an example of political socialization. Zero COVID would be another good example of political socialization. You're trying to transform the attitudes of your people. So the Chinese government had to convince people that zero COVID was the best way to defeat the pandemic. Political socialization is not limited to just democratic nations. It could also emerge in authoritarian. So keep that in mind. So that's the difference between those two. So civil society, you have processes that are, a part of the democratic, you have organizations, groups that work towards democratizing their respective countries, and political socialization is not limited to democratic nations. It could occur in authoritarian. Explain how long each of the term limits are. Yeah, no problem. Term limits is pretty straightforward. So, we're talking about um, the importance of term limits, right? Term limits are usually a sign of democratic consolidation. So countries set up systems in which they their executives or their legislatures can't serve for a lifetime, although that doesn't happen in authoritarian countries, as we'll see. So the UK, interestingly, let's go through. The UK has no term limits. The executive could serve as long as they are in power, and ultimately as long as their party remains in power. Oh, what a throw! Nice. Sorry, I'm watching a Brewers game. Give me a second here. Um, so in the UK, there's no term limits. That's why Thatcher, the milk snatcher, um, was in power for over 11 years. However, Parliament, when a general election occurs, that prime minister may lose their power because their party is no longer in power. That happened to Winston Churchill during World War II. A great example is that the Liberal Party won the general election towards the end of World War II. Attlee Clement became the prime minister. Churchill was out. Most people don't realize Churchill did not finish the war as prime minister. Um, and so when you look at Parliament, um, although there are no term limits, there are a couple areas in which members of parliament do have the ability to restrict the prime minister. One is that the prime minister can be removed through a vote of no confidence. So if the prime minister if parliament feels as if the prime minister is truly um, not doing their job correctly, they can be voted out. Also, in 2011, the Parliaments Act of 2011 introduced fixed terms for a parliament of 5 years. So, Parliament is typically in power in the UK for 5 years. That was not always historically the case. Parliament would be dissolved by the monarch when the monarch felt there needed to be a change. So, in terms of every 5 years, there's a general election. We'll be coming up on a general election within the UK in a year or so. So that's going to be interesting to see which direction, whether the Liberals can take back um, control for the first time in decades or the conservative Tories hang tight. Mexico executive, 1 6-year term, no reelection. No reelection. Um, no reelection in Mexico. You get one shot and then you're out. Um, In the legislature, however, the Senate has 6-year terms, so similar to the US, 6-year terms, and you are eligible to run for more than one term in the Senate. The Chamber of Deputies is 3 years, and you can run for a consecutive second term, although that's it. So Mexico is very strict. It completely limits you in the presidency to one term and in Congress 2 terms. Whereas if you compare that to the US, for example, the US has no term limits on Senate and House of Reps, which is mind boggling. That's how you get people like Dianne Feinstein that have been in Congress now for over 40 something years. And that's a raging debate here in the US as to whether we should have term limits on our legislature. Nigeria president, 4-year term, 2-term limit, 4 and 2, just like the US. A little different though in the legislature. In the Senate, it's 4 years unlimited, and the House, it's 4 years unlimited. So Nigeria, it's that's where it sort of differs from the US. 4 years, 4 and 4. Russia. All right, so this gets a little confusing here. Let's start with Russia's legislature, Federal Assembly, or the Federation Council. Federation Council. So they're on 4-year terms. 4 years. Uh, Specific questions. FRQ. Yes, I think that's a good compare and contrast with the FRQ. Yes, and I do think that you'll see multiple choices about the nature of term limits. Yes. Um, On the legislature, most likely not. But your ability to distinguish that there are term limits, that different countries approach term limits. I also think like an argumentative essay on term limits would be great. Brick, I saw your question. I can't say for sure, man. I do not know about argumentative essay, but term limits would be a good one, whether term limits are good or bad. Um, the Duma is on a 5-year term, in Russia. Let's talk about Russia's president, and we'll get to China and Iran, and we got to wrap things up because I got a 10 o'clock deadline. In China, the president was on a 2-term limit until 2018 when the constitution was revised and Xi Jinping is now ruler for life. The NPC, 5-year term. You're on a 5-year term in the NPC. In Iran, the supreme leader, no set term. They can be removed by the Assembly of Experts, but the president is on a 4-year term with 2 term limits. So Nigeria and Iran have the same term limits for their executive. Majlis serve 4-year terms. Can you speak on the EU, James? What I told my students is name one country that's still in the EU that's on the exam. And the answer is 0. Since the UK left, no one in the big 6 are a part of the EU. So what that means is I think that the EU would come up in supranational organizations and Brexit. But you don't need to know the ins and outs of the EU because the EU is no longer, there are no longer countries in the EU. So I wouldn't go too crazy on the EU. Just know about Brexit, know about the referendum, know about how it represented a debate over globalization, economic liberalization, neoliberalism. That's all part of the debate over Brexit, right? The conservatives wanted to move away from the sense of a globalization, and they fought against that and ultimately prevailed with 52 to 48% vote in the referendum. Am I missing anything here? Justin, I'm assuming you're not from. Yeah, we're just bouncing around. I've got time for a few more questions, so I'll try to make sure the answers are quick, but got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before I got to head out for the night. The Biafran War. That would not be on the exam most likely because there's not a lot of history, James, but it represents the ethnic divide. It was a Nigerian civil war between different ethnic groups, but the history questions are never on the exam. If the question is, give an example of a cleavage, then you could reference that historically, but that's not really quite relevant. Regulations around oil in Nigeria and Mexico. Well, Nigeria and Mexico, when it comes to oil, have done 2 different things. Mexico historically nationalized its oil, but in the last couple of decades, it's privatized oil. So it's given more and more power to private companies. Interestingly, the National Petroleum Corporation, the double NPC, did the same thing. It was a shocking move. I think we talked about in Nigeria, it accounted for like 76% of its country's revenue. So the double NPC going private was a massive deal. Now Nigeria is a rentier state, so it fully depends upon the oil industry, which thus creates the sense of the resource curse. Whereas Mexico has a more evolved economy that is not solely dependent on oil. Mexico has really championed the idea of the maquiladora system. So lots of foreign investment, lots of factories, lots of industries in Mexico. So Mexico does, however, have um, a sizable oil industry. Mexico traditionally was a very major oil power with the United States, but Mexico has moved further and further away from uh, nationalization of oil. How does the Communist Party dominate China? Well, they nominate. Oh yeah, only communists. Yeah, you can't be in the because the Politburo is the Politburo of the Communist Party. The Politburo is not an organ within the Chinese government. It's just within the party. So you really got to look at the Communist Party is separate from the government in the sense. Like the NPC has different representatives from different political parties, but the CPC is the supermajority. Within the CPC, you've got power structure of the Politburo, the standing committee of the Politburo, and so those are two separate elements. But the Communist Party controls appointing judges. It controls all aspects of the government because they have a supermajority. The military is under the Communist Party rule. Because remember, the leader of the Communist Party is also the head of the military, and then is almost always the president. Okay, how about one final question? One final question, maybe. The Politburo Standing Committee is um, the seven high-ranking members, um, including Xi Jinping. They are the most important, powerful people in China. The NPC Standing Committee. Remember, the NPC only meets once a year. It's just too many goddamn people. 3,000 delegates. So the NPC meets once a year. However, the NPC Standing Committee is the sort of elite group of the NPC. They meet once a month or bi-monthly to legislate. So the NPC's once a year meeting is ceremonial. It's a lot of pomp, circumstance, and then the standing committee of the NPC, however, they meet more regularly to actually pass laws and revise the constitution and whatnot. But of course, they're under the strict control of the Communist Party, so they are not independent. All right, it is approaching 10 o'clock, so didn't have a huge turnout. All good by me. I hope that you guys all benefit from this. I'll be for the students at Bullis. I'll be available during E block. That's the block right before lunch tomorrow. So I'll be available in our classroom. Whoever wants to come, if you're coming in the morning, if you're going to stay at home and prepare, good luck. If you're taking AP Lit, good luck. I hope that exam goes well. And for those of you not testing tomorrow and are testing on the 18th, you'll have plenty of time to um, gear up in the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to sign off, everyone. I appreciate you guys coming in. You're more than welcome. You're more than welcome. I had fun doing this. I'll be doing a push on Thursday night. So For the Basis DC crew, I'll be doing A Push on Thursday. So if you want to come back and hop on the A Push live stream, you're more than welcome. Take care, everybody. Have a great night. You're more than welcome, everybody.